So the topic today is religious diversity, and I want to look specifically at how this has been discussed in philosophical literature. And I want to look into a particular school of philosophy called analytical philosophy, and then to offer a few of my own thoughts on interreligious dialogue. And religious diversity nowadays, in this literature that I want to discuss, or in the philosophy of religion which is taught in universities across the country, it's one of the biggest issues discussed today. So alongside discussions on the existence of God, arguments for and against the existence of God, or the problem of evil, and so on and so forth, you'll also get discussions on religious diversity. So beginning with some background and starting at the beginning, I just wanted to mention the style of philosophy that I'm doing. People often ask me, so what philosophy are you doing? Are you doing Western philosophy or Islamic philosophy? So the style of philosophy is Western philosophy. It's not un-Islamic, and you'll get lots of Muslims that also practice this style of philosophy as well. And it's called analytical philosophy. It's following in the path of Gottlob Frege, who did a lot to develop logic from Aristotelian logic, which had remained in the way that it remained for centuries, and he did a lot to make it much more like maths. And then also Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Bertrand Russell being, of course, a British philosopher, and Ludwig Wittgenstein being Austrian philosopher, but who was also in this country for a period as well. But I don't want to overemphasize the link to these three figures. It's just that this style of philosophy, it goes back to them, but it's not that nowadays it's closely linked to them at all. And in this style of philosophy, this school of philosophy, there is an emphasis on logic and linguistic analysis. And it's quite distinct from another school of Western philosophy called continental philosophy, which is the type of philosophy found in Europe, France, for example, and other countries. So if you've come across figures such as Derrida, Montepolo, Sartre, I'm not doing that type of philosophy. It's something different to that. So that type of philosophy, and it is a bit sometimes like them and us, a bit less nowadays, but still, that's more like literature, whereas this philosophy I'm doing is more logical. And so in Iran, for example, where there's many different types of philosophy and philosophical schools, we'll have, say, like the philosophy of Sohrawardi, the Illuminationist philosophy, and then we'll have the philosophy of Ibn Sina, and then we'll have the philosophy of Mullah Sadra. This analytical philosophy, it's more like the philosophy of Ibn Sina, Avicenna in Latin, and less like the philosophy of Sohrawardi, the Illuminationist philosophy. And this philosophy that I've been talking about, analytical philosophy, it's mainly found in the English-speaking world. So sometimes it's called Anglo-American philosophy. So in the in the literature of analytical philosophy, which looks at religious diversity, it looks at religious diversity as a challenge to religious belief. So if we're going to assess this challenge to see if it really is something to be worried about or not, we should start with a definition. What is religious diversity? So quite simply, religious diversity is the existence of many religious traditions. And it's quite obvious to us in London, where we live and work among people practicing different religions, believing in different religions. In other parts of the world it's not so obvious. But it's still there, unless you live in the middle of nowhere. And I think it's been present throughout history. Even in the time of the Prophet in Mecca, in Medina, you would have had different groups maybe a bit not quite like London, but still there would have been different religious groups. And of course, it's not just different religions when we speak about different religious diversity, as in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, but also within these traditions. So within Islam, you've got many, many groups. Within Christianity, you've got many, many different groups. Just for example, within Christianity, it's the Protestant churches which have split a great deal. So hundreds of Protestant churches. Within Islam, again, we might say we've got Shias on one denomination and Sunnis another, but we know it's much more complex than that. So we have a great deal of religious diversity. So that's why the word multitude could be used. And sometimes this fact, this phenomena, religious diversity, is sometimes referred to as religious pluralism, which I think is a bit confusing. So I'm not going to call it religious pluralism, but sometimes you might see this fact of religious diversity referred to as religious pluralism, especially among sociologists. So when sociologists are speaking of the diversity in London, they will say London is a pluralist society with many religions. But I'm going to save this word religious pluralism for something else that we'll move on to. And we can begin by thinking a little bit about what religion is. Religion is like a cultural system which has many, many different aspects. Quite often, if we ask someone what is a religion, they will say, define it in something like religion is belief in God or supreme being. But then you can bring counterexamples, say like Confucianism, for example. So a supreme being is not so important in Confucianism. And Confucianism, or people that follow the way of Confucius, it's not just a handful of people. We're talking about a massive country, China. So it affects the lives of millions of people. And they don't have God in the center of that way of life. So we can't define religion in a closed, in a very narrow way by saying religion is just belief in God, for example. Religion is much more than that. It encompasses belief, doctrine, that's correct, but it also encompasses like an aim towards something greater, like to be saved or to be liberated from the worldly life. It includes techniques or a method to gain access to something beyond or to improve your situation. It includes moral teachings as well. So we can't just limit the definition of religion to just belief, for example. But having said that, I do want to focus on belief in this presentation. So when we're talking about religious diversity, I'm going to be looking at the diversity of religious beliefs. And this creates, or so it's been thought, creates a challenge insofar that it creates a confidence problem. It's an issue insofar that someone might feel challenged. If there's so many different religious beliefs, then how do I know my religious beliefs are correct? When there's so much disagreement, how can I be sure that I have the truth? That's one challenge of religious diversity, and it'll be the challenge that I will be addressing. But there is another challenge which people are often interested in, and this is the soteriological or salvific challenge of religious diversity. So if people are convinced of the truth of their religion and that they are going to be saved, well, what about their good neighbour, for example? Will they also be saved? What type of God would allow me to be saved, but as a Muslim say, but my Hindu neighbour, who is a very nice person, smiles to me every day, is good with their family, does charitable works, are they going to be sent to hell? This is a different issue, and it's more of a theological issue, and it's not something I'll be looking into today, but just to mention that it is a major concern when people discuss religious diversity. So this is the question: is religious diversity a defeater for religious belief? And I'll be looking at some of the responses that philosophers have given to this, and looking at some of the factors that can be identified that might help us to come up with our own answer to the question. But before moving into looking at specific philosophers and the way that they have addressed the challenge of religious diversity, we can look at the way that we categorize responses. So the blue box on the left, if we take that to be on the left as you're looking at it, if we take that to be the fact of religious diversity, and few people would deny that it's a fact because we experience it. If we take that to be the fact, then there's three different initial approaches that we can make, or the three initial responses we can make to that fact. So the first would be non-realism, and that's my term for just rejecting religious belief. So if there's so many different religious beliefs, if there's Muslims and Christians and Hindus and Jews and Shintos and Confucians, and the list goes on, and all the local religions with local gods and in rural regions of the world. And if we add all these religions, if they're all disagreeing with each other, then perhaps they're all wrong. And okay, so that's that, and maybe so we might just call that atheism, for example. But it's to deny that there's any truth whatsoever in religion. Because if they can't agree, then maybe they're all wrong. And the next approach is relativism. And relativism is like a swear word in philosophy. If you call someone a relativist, that's like being rude to them. This is the way it is. Although relativism is a very broad term, so it can mean different things, and usually people don't define what it means. So relativism, which is something that comes up a lot in philosophical discussions, is the position that X is relative to Y. So then you have to fill in the X and the Y. So if I say something like, our language is relative to where we're born, or our grammatical beliefs are relative to where we're born, well, that's not very controversial. If you're born in England, you speak English. If you're born in Spain, you speak Spanish. If you're born in Morocco, you speak Arabic. That's not too controversial. What's more controversial is when you say something like your conception of truth is relative to where you're born, because we like to think of a truth, ethical truth, or different epistemic truth to do with knowledge. We like to think it's something universal. So if I say my understanding of truth depends on where I'm born, well, that's more controversial. Or if I like to say something like my understanding of morality depends on the period in history that I was born in, or the country or the geographical location that I was born in, that gets a bit more controversial. I won't be looking at these responses. I'll be looking at the next response, which is realism, which says that there is truth in religious belief, and just because there's religious disagreement doesn't mean that there is no truth in religion whatsoever, or it doesn't mean that what is true for me is true for me, but what is true for you is also true for you, which is a relativist position. Okay, so looking at realist responses to religious diversity, we see there's three types, and the first is exclusivism, second inclusivism, and the third pluralism. So exclusivism is the position that one religion is true and all the rest are false. So a Muslim believes that Islam is true and all the other religions are false. Christian believes Christianity is true and all the other religions are false, and so forth. Inclusivism is when you believe, it's similar to exclusivism. So still the Muslim will believe Islam is true, still the Christian will believe Christianity is true, but they will say there's also grains of truth in other religions. So this is if we're focusing on truth, which we are. So if we're focusing on salvation, for example, you would say that a Christian will say Christians will go to the highest level of heaven, for the sake of argument, or Christians will, following Christianity, will help them to be saved in the best way possible, but there's other people that can also be saved. So, for example, a Muslim would say Islam is the best way to save a person from damnation, a best way to save them from the world, from their own soul, from the evil of the hell, and to take them into heaven. So that is if we were looking at salvation, at soteriology, but we said we're looking at belief. So inclusivism is just the idea that one religion is the most true and the other ones share in that truth in some way. And then we move on to pluralism. So pluralism, you've probably guessed by now, is the position that more than one religion is true, because we're focusing on truth and not salvation or not morality or not other things. And this three-part distinction, it originated with Alan Race in his book Christians and Religious Pluralism in 1983, and it's been used ever since, and it's very popular in discussion of religious diversity. And so usually we have this exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, and you combine it with an adjective like epistemic exclusivism or moral exclusivism, and so forth, to define exactly what we're talking about. And it is important to define exactly what we're talking about, because different people could believe different things about different aspects of religion. So it's quite plausible to believe that a Muslim, say, is convinced of the truth of Islam and rejects all other religions, but when it comes to salvation, who will go to heaven, who will go to hell, it can be maybe a bit more open. For example, I mean, different people believe different things, but it's plausible to think that a Muslim will be exclusivist with regard to epistemology, with regards to beliefs, but when it comes to salvation, they'll be a bit more open. So they might be an inclusivist, for example, or even a pluralist. And I'm reminded of a book that does tackle this question of soteriology, of salvation in Islam, by Muhammad Hassan Khalil, published by Oxford University Press, Islam and the Salvation of Others, just published a few years ago. And he looks at some different figures in the Islamic tradition. And what was interesting from his book to note is that not even Ibn Taymiyyah believed that, according to his reading, that non-Muslims would go to hell forever. So there are differences that can be had, and this is why we use this different terminology. So the exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, along with the adjective, whether it's to do with salvation or epistemology or morality, just so we can talk exactly and definitely, and rather than vaguely. So I will be moving on to specific responses to religious diversity. That's looking at the responses that specific philosophers have given to religious diversity. But to begin with, I just wanted to point out to the four factors which run throughout their responses to religious diversity and throughout their attempts to make religious belief seem rational in the face of religious diversity. So the first factor is epistemic obligations. So whether you believe that religious diversity defeats religious belief depends on what you think your epistemic obligations are. So if you think your epistemic obligations are to go and look for evidence and to make logical arguments, and to study as hard as you can all the religions of the world, and then decide, well, that might make you end up believing one thing about different religions. But if you think it's not necessary, and whatever, as long as you've read a book here and there, you can make your own mind up without having to investigate too deeply, well, that might lead you to believing something else about religious diversity. And then we've got religious ambiguity, which I find quite an interesting concept. So you're probably familiar with the duck-rabbit picture. So is it a duck looking this way, left, or is it a rabbit looking that way? So you can probably see both. So this came from Wittgenstein. Can you see it? Can you see both? If you squint your eyes, you see a duck, and if you look the other way, you see a rabbit. So this is what we would call an optical illusion, maybe, or it's ambiguous. So you can't see it's a duck, you can't say it's a rabbit, it's something ambiguous. Well, that makes it even more complicated. Well, this is just a model, a sample. You know, if we say that the world, or the religious manifestation of the universe, and our experience of the universe's religious aspects is ambiguous, then, well, that will make us think one way about religious diversity. But if we think, no, the universe isn't ambiguous, all we have to do is study a few books, follow logical arguments, and everything becomes clear. And the next factor is epistemic parity. So some philosophers believe that all religions are more or less have the same epistemic basis as each other. So there's no one religion is obviously more true than another. So that's another factor to look at. And the last factor which comes up in these discussions is the extent to which the religions are incompatible. So, for example, the concept of God we have in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and other religions, but are they talking about the same being, or are they talking about different beings? Because if they're making different statements about the same being, that's when you get a contradiction. And so you can't have two things true in a contradictory statement. So, for example, if Christians say God is triune, and Muslims and Jews say God is indistinguishable, he's one. So that would seem to make a direct contradiction, either he's one or he's three. So which one is it? You can't have both at the same time. But if this is metaphorical language, or if there's some sort of compatibility, or if they're not talking of the same being, for example, if there's some sort of thing that we can think of in some way to reconcile, then the religions aren't incompatible, so there's no contradiction. So moving on to these specific responses that I've promised, let's start with a philosopher called Richard Swinburne. So I'm looking at contemporary philosophers in the analytical school of philosophy of religion. And Richard Swinburne has tried his best to prove that Christianity is true. And he's written 3 books on the existence of God, and they're called a trilogy, and then 4 books on the proof of the Christian religion, so a trilogy and a tetralogy. He's set forth this would seem to make sense. So if we're not sure which religion is true, we give our arguments, we use the best facts available, and the best logic that we can come up with, and we see if we can offer good arguments. So this would seem to be something very natural, something very instinctive. And Richard Swinburne is working in this tradition of natural theology, and he very much agrees with the method of Thomas Aquinas, who was a medieval Christian figure who sat down and thought through all the church doctrines and tried to come up with proofs and arguments for them, not just for the existence of God, but then for things beyond that as well. So Swinburne has tried to sit down and figure it all out, And this statement is indicative of how Swinburne works. So I do not need, this is Swinburne talking, I do not need to make a detailed investigation if I can show that none of those religions even claim for themselves characteristics to be expected a priori of a true religion and claimed by Christianity, and that there is enough evidence that Christianity does have these characteristics, for then I will be in a position to argue that there are reasons adequate to show that the Christian religion is more likely to be true than they are. So Richard Swinburne believes in adequate investigation, and he believes in using objectively correct inductive criteria, and that if we investigate all the different religions and use the correct logical criteria, then we can work out which religion is true. But I don't find him very convincing. So for example, his expectations that he speaks about in these quotes, so his expectations might seem reasonable to him, but with someone with different background beliefs, with a different starting point in life, they might not find his expectations plausible at all. So for example, when it comes to the Trinity, he will say if there is a God, so he's argued that there's a God, and then he will say that it makes sense, or it's good that a God should have a partner so he could share his love. And then it would be good if those partners would create a third God, or a third partner, so there would be more love to share between them. I mean, I'm just paraphrasing, but that's what he said. So, to be fair to him, he says that the Christian understanding of the Trinity is very much based on revelation, but he tries to give a justification for it as well, a logical justification. But to us, it might not seem, to a Muslim, it won't seem very convincing. So his expectations of what a true religion will look like might be convincing for him, but not for others. And that's just one example. So, for example, the atonement, the Christian doctrine of the atonement, which is roughly that God had to send his son down, or God had to send his son, incarnate himself in the son, to die on the cross to save humanity from sin. So his intuition tells him that a perfect life, which is Jesus of Nazareth, as he believes, is a perfect life sacrificed on the cross, is enough to compensate for all sin done by mankind. That's what he thinks. But his intuition is a bit different from other intuitions. And so on and so forth throughout his philosophies. He comes up with intuitions and expectations of what we would expect a religion to be like, and then he argues on that basis, and it's perhaps not too convincing. But this is one response, and it's a summary of some of the issues that I see in his philosophy. Like I say, he has many books, and he does a good job defending himself, but when it comes to the final analysis, I think he does lack, because he relies too much on his expectations of what a religion should be like, and those expectations aren't widely shared. So we next come to a philosopher, an American philosopher, born in the same year as Richard Swinburne, called Alvin Plantinga. So if Richard Swinburne was looking for evidence and for argument and trying to argue his way, Alvin Plantinga doesn't do that. Alvin Plantinga comes up, in fact he's trying to say that we don't need to argue for our beliefs, in opposite to Richard Swinburne. And so he comes up with a concept called warrant, that if our beliefs are warranted, that is sufficient. So what does Plantinga mean by warrant? There's 4 factors which are involved in Plantinga's warrant. So if a belief is produced by a properly functioning cognitive faculty, where the proper functioning is determined by a design plan, successfully aimed at truth, and there are no defeaters, no overriding objections, then we can say a belief is warranted. So, for example, if I see a flower in front of me due to my perceptual faculty, and I'm not too tired, I haven't just stepped off an international flight, I haven't had a bang on the head coming into college, then I can say that that perceptual faculty should be working properly and I should be seeing the flower as it is. And there's no other objections to discount that. Like, I'm not wearing rose-tinted spectacles, I'm not, no practical jokers in the room, I hope, playing a practical joke on me. So we can say that my perceptual faculty should be seeing that flower. So when it comes to religious belief, Plantinga says that there are certain faculties which give us religious belief. One of them being the sensus divinitatis, which is Latin for divine sense, which is very similar to the Islamic concept of fitra. And we just know that God exists. We don't have to argue, we don't have to look at evidence, we don't have to do a lot of studying, we just know. So Amir Dastmalchian is a Christian and is arguing for the truth of Christianity. So he'll say a Christian can open up the Bible and they will hear God talking to them. Or, for example, they might stand on a mountaintop and they will just know that God exists without ever having to think about it, without ever having to reason to that conclusion. It's just the conclusion that comes to them, and they can be sure in that. And then there's another model, so that gets us to believe in God, but Plantinga says we can know about the very specifics of Christianity, the good things of the gospel, the full panoply of Christian beliefs, as he puts it. And he says there's another model besides the sensus divinitatis, and that's the internal instigation of the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit, according to Plantinga, will give us Christian beliefs. We don't have to reason, we don't have to think, we don't have to argue. The Holy Spirit does the work. So, for example, reading a Bible passage, it will just become clear to us. Or, for example, if we've sinned, then we will feel wrong in our heart, and we will turn to God automatically without having to think about that, or without having to find evidence or discuss logically. So, according to Plantinga, religious beliefs, or particularly Christianity in his view, can have warrant because of these two models. So just the same way I talked about perception, another faculty could be memory, for example. I remember having a banana before coming because this faculty tells me. It's just instant, it's basic or foundational, what we, in philosophy can sometimes be called. So Plantinga's way to justify religious belief in a specific religious tradition, and in his case it's Christianity, his way to justify it is called the basic belief apologetic, because he's not arguing, he's not investigating, he says someone doesn't need to do that, they just know. So let's move to William Alston. William Alston, he's interesting because although he, again, takes a similar view to Alvin Plantinga, he says for the sake of argument, we'll pretend that there is no good argument for the truth of a particular religion. And again, he's coming from a particular Christian background, so he's saying he wants to say that Christianity is true, but he'll, for the sake of argument, say that there's no argument for the truth of Christianity. He calls it a worst case scenario. So in the worst case scenario, we'll say there is no truth, that no proof for the truth of Christianity. So in the worst case scenario, if there is no proof even conceivable for a particular religious view, so in the absence of that proof, would we be any less reasonable in believing what we already believe? So if a Christian is raised in a Christian home, or a Muslim is raised in a Muslim home, or a Buddhist is raised in a Buddhist home, that's all they know, and then they come across the existence of different religions, well, what should they do? So in the worst case scenario where they have no argument, or they have no logical leg to stand on, then he says, well, just stick with what you have. Because if there's no argument to suggest any different, you can't even conceive of an argument, like for the sake of argument, you can't even conceive of an argument to prove your own views, well, just stick with what you have. In his own words, incompatible propositions can each be justified for different people if what they have to go on is suitably different. So both Alvin Plantinga and William Austin, by the way, they're part of a trend in philosophy called reformed epistemology. So they've tried to argue that religious belief doesn't need evidence, it doesn't need disputation, it can just be something foundational or basic. So the last specific response that I want to look at, trying to justify religious beliefs, trying to give a response to religious diversity, is John Hick. So John Hick does agree with Alston. He agrees, and I haven't looked too much into Alston's background and his views, but Alston believes that religious experience, personal experiences that happen to people, is what the best way of justifying religious beliefs. So Hick agrees with him on that. But he says we have to abandon this assumption that only one religion can be true. So Alston, he somehow assumes this, that only one religion has to be true, therefore we stick with the religion that we know. Whereas Hick says we just have to abandon that assumption. And he says it's arbitrary to prefer our own religion to any other. And Hick comes up with the concept of the real to try and explain his ideas. So the real is what he calls ultimate reality, or the supreme reality, or whatever we want to call it. Of course, as Muslims, we would call it God, Christians would say God, Hindus would say Brahman, and so on and so forth in different religions. So Buddhists, for example, many Buddhists won't have the concept of God, but they will have another concept which of some sort of transcendental or transcendent entity which is supreme and more than this mundane life. And he distinguishes, and his distinction is inspired by Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's distinction between noumena and phenomena. So the noumena is, so I see this bottle, for example, that's a phenomenon, but behind that there's and I perceive it in a certain way, but what I perceive is filtered through my perceptual faculties, and how that bottle is in reality is actually a different way. And there's other such examples to distinguish between how something is in itself and how we perceive it. So applying this distinction to the real, or to supreme reality or ultimate reality, or however you want to think of it, we say that there is a way that the real is itself, and it's beyond words. But there's a way that we understand the real as people. So Christians understand this supreme reality as a triune God, as Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Christians and Muslims understand this reality as one God, and Hindus will understand this reality as Brahma, as manifested in many, many gods. So there's a distinction to be made, and Hick relies on that distinction to say that, we'll see what he says, because on the next slide I wanted to summarize my discussion so far. So I did mention that there are 4 factors that come through responses to religious diversity. And we've looked at 4 responses, and each of these has 4 factors involved in them. We looked at Swinburne, Plantinga, Olson and Hick. And starting with Swinburne, we see that Swinburne is what we call an evidentialist. He believes that you have to find the evidence for a particular religious view. And also, when we talk of any justification in epistemology, he's an internalist. So internalism is the view that to be justified about a belief, you have to know it, internally aware that you're justified, and that you've met your obligations, whatever they may be. So that's Swinburne's view. This evidentialism and internalism in epistemology, they go together. Swinburne doesn't believe the world is particularly religiously ambiguous. He thinks with good arguments, good investigation, and good logical criteria, we can come to recognizing the truth. He doesn't believe that the religions are in a very similar position epistemically. He believes that one religion clearly is true and the others are not. And he does believe religions are incompatible, because if they're incompatible, then we can't say something like they're all true. So we can't have a contradiction and say everything is true within a contradiction. They do contradict each other, the religions, and therefore only one of them can be true. And so that's why Richard Swinburne is an exclusivist. So then we go to Plantinga, and it's a similar story, except we saw that Plantinga didn't believe in evidence. He believed that beliefs can be justified or warranted based on faith. And we call that position fideism, or he's a fideist. Fideism can mean different things, but roughly I think it can apply to Plantinga. And this again is like another swear word in philosophy. So philosophy, religion. So if you call someone a fideist when they don't think they are, they might not take kindly to that. And fideism comes hand in hand with externalism with respect to epistemic justification. So externalism is the opposite to internalism. So the idea that you don't have to be aware of what is justifying your belief, just as long as it is justified. As long as, for example, you have a reliable process justifying your belief and making you have true beliefs, that's fine. You don't have to know the ins and outs of how that works, just as long as you're getting true beliefs. And then we get to Alston. So Alston, if you go deeper into his epistemology, deeper than I've gone in today, he has both externalism and internalism. So again, he says that we don't have to know what is making our religious beliefs true, just as long as they are being true, that's enough. But he's also an internalist because when he is looking at certain faculties of belief, he says that they have significant self-support, that we know they're putting us in touch with the truth. So just the same way I had a banana before arriving, I can't prove it, there's no logical proof. But I know internally, from my memory, that it's true. But that's circular. So how do I know I had a banana? Because I remember it. But how do I remember it? Because I remember it. So usually in philosophy we don't like circularity, but sometimes we have to make an exception. And so Alston is combining externalism and internalism. And he assumes, for the sake of argument, that there is religious ambiguity, that the world is religiously not clear. And he assumes, for the sake of argument, that different religions are on the same footing epistemically. He does believe that religions are incompatible. And the result, as we've seen, is that in such a situation, he just says that we stick with the religion we know. So Hick, contrary to all the other thinkers that we've looked at, Hick is a pluralist. He believes that more than one religion is true. And more specifically, he says the great religions of the world are true. And he says that if a religious tradition is well established, and if it is transforming its followers from being selfish into being focused on something more than themselves, then that religion must be putting its followers into touch with that greater reality. So he's a pluralist, and he says many different religions can be true because they're not incompatible. So for example, let's take an example from Shakespeare. So Shakespeare says the world is an oyster, but he also says all the world is a stage. So if we take that literally, that's contradictory, because either the world is an oyster or the world is a stage. But no one takes that literally. They're both metaphors. And Hick says the same about religion. So what a Christian understands God to be as triune, and a Muslim understands God to be one. These are metaphors for helping us to understand something which is beyond metaphor and beyond description. So in this way, Hick tries to make the different religious traditions compatible. And I said Hick does agree with Olson's epistemology. He's an internalist. He does believe the world is religiously ambiguous. There's no one religion that stands out, and he does believe that they're all about as good as each other. So that's a brief summary of the different responses to religious diversity that can be found in the analytical philosophy of religion today. So we should move. Actually, I just wanted to mention something that occurred to me about this discussion of religious diversity. So I think it's quite similar to discussions on hadith. So if we have lots of different hadith and they're all contradictory, or there's a group of hadith which are similar and another group which are similar but they contradict each other, well, this is quite, this can be a good parable for different religions. And quite often a hadith scholar, when they're examining different hadith, which are narrations of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, the most interesting conclusions come when he tries to reconcile the different hadith, the different contradictory hadith. And I think this discussion is relevant. So Hick, so Swinburne, Panting and Alston, they see, for example, to follow this example, they see hadith conflicting, so they say only one can be true, whereas Hick is trying to reconcile them somehow. Let's move on a little bit now to talking about religious dialogue. So there's a model of religious dialogue which invokes the head, the heart, and the hand. So dialogue involving the head is very intellectual. We sit down around a table, perhaps we discuss with people of different religions or within the same religion. So we can have inter-religious dialogue or we can have intra-religious dialogue. That's all very well. For scholars, that's what they like to do, sit together and talk. But it's not applicable for everyone. So especially if we go to our communities, to mosques, to churches, to gurdwaras, to synagogues, what have you, you will find only some people are interested in discussing the basis of their faith and the ins and outs of their faith. Most people, they're more interested in having an emotional connection. And so when Dr. Inlows mentioned about a paper I wrote on dialogue and music, my idea was to say that, yes, if we want to have a more effective dialogue or a more transformative dialogue, then we need to leave the talking aside and we need to connect hearts. and how to connect arts through art forms, through film, or through even, I've heard stories of people making patchwork quilts. There's all sorts of different arts. I did look at music, but I did mention that music is haram, of course. And I discussed some of the issues that Muslims might have with having a musical dialogue. But to say that it's not correct to say there's no music in Islam, there might be reservations about music, of course, and about instruments in particular. But we can say there's musicality. And I think one of the previous speakers, in fact I know one of the previous speakers because I watched it on YouTube, he very eloquently portrayed the musicality of the Quran through the maqamat. And now we don't call this music, but if we were to use a word that other people would find familiar, then we have to use that word, musicality. And so, for example, a reciter reciting the Quran could maybe have a dialogue or exchange notes, or exchange, have a heart-to-heart with, say, a Gregorian chanter from the Catholic tradition, or from the Jewish tradition of a cantor reciting the Torah. So this hearts can be connected. And the third one is dialogue of the hand. So when you actually do things together. So when people of different religious traditions get together and do something like feed the poor, or to clean up the streets, or to visit the sick in hospital. And so these three dialogues are all very important. And of course, with the material that I've been discussing today, it's mainly about dialogue of the head. So when we're speaking about truth in religion, if we want to speak about truth with other people, it's a very intellectual dialogue. And that's fine, but it's just one of others. So if we are considering discussing with people of other religious faiths about truth in religious belief, if I have strong religious beliefs, I want to discuss with someone else that has strong religious beliefs, there's no point in pretending that we don't have strong religious beliefs, so we can start discussing them. However, it does require an element of humility and diplomacy. Diplomacy insofar that if you say, I have the truth, and they say, I have the truth, well, you're not going to get very far. And also a bit of humility, because it never ceases to amaze me how different people's starting points can be, or how different people's intuitions can be. So we saw at the beginning Richard Swinburne, who had figured it all out for himself, how Christianity can be true, but what was seen to be intuitive for him wasn't so intuitive for other people. And just to give you an example or two, just recently I showed a film which followed children memorizing the Quran, and they were going to an international competition in Cairo, and they were reciting, and some of them had memorized the whole Quran and could recite it with very good tajweed. And I thought it was a very profound film, how you would have a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old reciting in front of a panel of judges. And even one of the judges, who was a very prestigious Qari, Sheikh Shuaisha, he even wept in the film, at witnessing a young boy at the age of 10 reciting the Quran perfectly from memory, who didn't even know Arabic. He was from Tajikistan. So if you are interested, the film is called Quran by Heart. That's Koran, and it's on YouTube. And although I've spoiled some of it for you, do watch it. It's a very beautiful film. However, at the end of it, there was a Christian student in my class, and he raised a good point. Fair enough. He said, isn't this immoral that they're indoctrinating their children from a young age, and they're making them recite the Quran and memorize the Quran? So I never thought of that, and maybe lots of Muslims wouldn't think of that, but he thought of it just to illustrate how people think in different ways, and it can surprise us. Another example I have is I heard of a Marxist gentleman or someone who had grown up in a Marxist family, so he had no concept of God. And in fact, if he ever mentioned God growing up, then he'd get a smack. So people have very different beliefs, very different assumptions, and when we meet them and discuss with them, we have to be a little bit humble and diplomatic and appreciate that. But if we do want to discuss truth with other people, it might be good to enter the discussion talking of process, in terms of process. So to relate back to the 4 factors that I mentioned, epistemic obligations, religious ambiguity, religious incompatibility, and epistemic parity. So if we say that we believe what we do because we take this approach on religious ambiguity, we take this approach of religious incompatibility, that's breaking it down a little bit more. Rather than just say, I think Islam is true, because there's this proof and that proof, and you're saying to someone else who doesn't even believe in any of these proofs, just break it down. Maybe just say, I believe it's important to have evidence for our religious beliefs. I think it's important to investigate our religious beliefs. Because then you know what you're dealing with. Because if you're speaking to someone else who doesn't even believe in evidence, then you're not going to get very far, and you identify where the disagreement is. So I think this conversation on religious diversity, it helps us speak about truth in interreligious dialogue in a way which might not have been diplomatic. And just to remind you something I said, it's important, I think, just to close, to remember what's at stake. So when different people from different religions are talking to each other, it's not just for a friendly chat or to convince the other people of truth. It's more than that, because there's so much injustice in the world that I think people of faith can get together and work together. For example, to feed the poor, or to clean up the streets, or to visit the sick in hospital. There's a lot of work to be done, and we can work together to do it. Not to gloss over our disagreements, but just to be aware that there's a lot of work to be done. And with that, I close. Thank you for your attention.